Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Howdy. How y'all doing today? Good. Fantastic. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you for coming on down and joining us for the American Indian Life series today. My name is Kody Grant. I'll be the one who's running the program for you. Now, I work with the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg, and our main focus is to talk about the different tribes that come and go through Williamsburg in the 18th century. So we really discuss what those relationships look like with the different tribes that England has treaties with, right? So we may talk to you about some of the local tribes like the Pamunkeys and the Mampanoys and the Chickahominys, who are tributary tribes of England, or we're talking about tribes that travel in from 500 or 600 miles away, like Cherokee, Creeks, or Shawnees, or Iroquois, or you're here to make treaties with the royal governor. But when we talk about those relationships in the 18th century, we're really only brushing the surface, right? We're really talking about those Anglo-Native relations in the 18th century. So if we think about England or Cherokee or Creek as these folks as an iceberg, right? Like a cultural iceberg. There are all the things that intrinsically make them who they are with their worldview, their religious structures, family systems, governments, and etc. But that's all what happens in their own communities, right? In their own countries. So when we talk about those relationships here in the city, we're really only looking at those surface level interactions, right? So this program, the American Indian Life Series, is a way for us to take a step outside of Williamsburg and look at these cultural aspects about these tribes that make them very unique among one another, right? So, for instance, the topic we're going to be discussing today has to do with the idea of captive taking and hostage exchange, which is a very old ancient practice that's been done here between southeast and northeastern tribes for as long as we know, that simply continues on into the 18th century and eventually comes to an end in the early 19th century. So where we talk about some of these what are known as captive narratives from the colonial period, in which it says, oh, so-and-so was captured by the Indians and we never saw him again, right? Or old Susie was captured off of the plantation, they took her out to that tribe and they freed her and adopted her and she's living as a Shawnee person now, right? It always comes from this notion of who it's happening to, where it happened, the circumstances surrounding it, where they went to, if they know, but they never really talk about the why. Why do these tribes take captives in the first place, right? So that's what we're going to be delving in today. So we're going to look at why southeastern, northeastern woodland tribes, like Cherokees and Creeks and Shawnees, basically all the tribes that inhabit the Appalachian Mountains from down in Georgia, extending all the way up into the Great Lakes regions, why do they practice this notion of captive taking? So we're going to look at three main topics. The first one has to do with the idea of bringing somebody in and adopting them and accepting them as citizens. These are usually developed out of what we call mourning wars. Sometimes when people die and pass away within our community, the women will necessitate the need for bringing somebody in to replace this person. The second one has to do with the idea of war and conflict between our different tribes. So war for us is a way for individuals to settle personal disputes through physical violence where words have failed, but that's inevitably going to lead to people losing their lives. And because women are the heads of those households, a debt has to be paid to the family that that person was taken from. Now, the third one is a lot more to do with political discourse between foreign nations. This is the idea of hostage exchange. So hostage exchange between different tribes is a way of opening up avenues of communication with both of our allies and our adversaries. So this is a way we're going to use the idea of exchanging folks between our communities to help build bridges. All right? So we're going to talk about these three main topics, right, which gives us a kind of rough, roundabout idea as to why captive taking happens. And then it should take us about maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then I'll open up to see if y'all have any questions about that topic. All right, so as I'm going through this subject, if you think of something or something pops up in your head or sounds curious, the only thing I ask is that you hold on to your question towards the end of the program, and I'll make sure we kind of get to those before we cut loose for the evening. All right? So during that time frame, if you have to leave at any point, please feel free to do so. Very glad that you're able to come down and join us for as long as you did. And then if you want to take pictures and stuff like that, that's totally fine with me too. I don't really mind at all. All right? So with that, thank you all folks. You just walked in. We're going to be talking about captive taking and hostage exchange in the 18th century. Y'all made it right on time. So to look at this first instance, right, the idea of bringing somebody back to be adopted. This has a lot to do with our family and citizenship. So for a lot of our communities, a lot of these southeast, northeastern woodland tribes are mostly matrilineal. So that means that our families are always tracked down through our mother rather than our fathers. So your connection to a tribe, right, what makes you Cherokee versus Shawnee is going to be purely dependent upon where your mother is from. So if you are born to a Cherokee woman, you're going to become automatically a Cherokee citizen, right? You are a natural born Cherokee citizen. So you will have been raised there from birth. You speak Cherokee, worship Cherokee, practice Cherokee system of government, and etc., right? Everything that makes them who they are. But that connection really comes down to family, right? So when you're born to that woman, you are not only bound to her by blood ties, but you are also born into her extended family. So many of these tribes have what you would refer to as clans. That's what they are, nothing more than extended families. Within Cherokee society, there are 7 different clans. You could be born into Ani Shawnee, which is their blue clan. Ani Wode is their pink. Ani Jishkwa is their bird. Ani Gotgehui is a wild potato. Ani Ahui is their deer. Ani Waya is our wolf clan. And then there's Ani Gilohi, which is our long hair clan. So each of these clans has some type of social responsibility that they have to do for the good of the community as a whole. But ultimately, that's how you know you're connected to this society, separate of any other nation that exists in the world, right? Whether that be tribes that are near to us or folks who are coming from across the water, right? So anybody outside of our tribe, because they're not our kin, we can go to war with those folks. We can politic with those folks. We can take captives of those folks. We can marry those folks. We can have children with those folks, etc. Because the only caveat is you can't marry within your own clan. You can't war within your own family, and etc. So within these societies, we all exist in our own kind of cultural bubbles, right? We have this kind of live and let live attitude of we work this land and we live here and we have our societies, and those folks over there have their own society and area to live in too. So we kind of keep our own distance, right? We keep our own territory. So what happens when somebody passes away, right? So if somebody born in this society already has a place in this community, that's not adding to our numbers, right? So if somebody passes away, we are at a loss. So this instance of folks when they pass away and nobody's responsible for the death of this person, that woman who is the head of that household may make a determination with the family that she's in charge of that somebody needs to be brought back to replace this individual. So the void that's created by the loss of that kin person, somebody's going to be brought back to be adopted to fill that hole. This is what starts a mourning war, right? M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. So this woman will task one of the men from her family, right? Could be somebody from her immediate household or her clan, to say, I need you to go out into a neighboring community and I need you to capture somebody to bring them back to be adopted, right? This is going to be a new son, or I need you to bring me back a new daughter. So this practice has been done for so long, there's kind of like a ritual form to how this occurs. So this man's going to gather up some accoutrements he needs to do this business. Most notably, going to be what we call a captive tie, or what's known as a slave halter. Basically, these are purpose-made ropes from dog mane or Indian hemp, basswood bark, that may be dyed and be very plain, or they can be highly decorated with turkey beard, porcupine quills, moose hair embroidery, etc. But the purpose of this rope is specifically to take these people against their will and to bind them up and to bring them on back to the community. Right? So some of these highly decorated ones could have designs that represent this notion of family and of households. We actually have one of these captive halters in our collections at Colonial Williamsburg, and it has moose hair embroidery on the collar, the piece that goes around the neck, and it has a row of triangles and rectangles minus one triangle. And it's a Shawnee captive halter. So I was able to talk with one of my buddies from out eastern Shawnee and ask him what that represented. And he said it represents the notion that for all of these houses, right, each of these rectangular triangles is a house. One of these homes is missing its arbor. It's incomplete. So for anybody who looks upon a captive bound with this item, represents to everybody else that this person's purpose is to be adopted, right? They are to make this household complete. One of the other things that this man might take may be a rattle, a musical instrument, for these captives to sing their death songs. Now, with our different nations where we exist in our own bubbles, we believe you can't exist in the same bubble in different bubbles at the same time, right? You are either within one community or you're in another community. So the notion of a death song is a symbolic gesture that your connection to your former nation, family, and etc. is dying off, right? It has to go away so you can be reborn into a new society. Another thing that might take is a change of clothes. There is a reference that I saw with a group of soldiers who said, when the Indians took us captive, they stripped us of our regimentals and they gave us a breech clout and a pair of moccasins to wear. This is again that kind of representation of your shedding off that former skin, right? But however long it takes, once this person's taken captive, however long it takes to get back to the community, because these men are still not the heads of household, the discretion as to whether or not these captives get to stay falls to the women, right? The heads of those communities. So like in Cherokee society, our system is based around matriarchs, right? So your mother for an unmarried man is going to be the most important woman in a man's life. After marriage, his wife is going to become the most important woman in his life. And then within that clan is going to be a clan mother. She is like the matriarch of that entire extended family within that community. And then there is a village matriarch, which is a beloved woman. She is basically going to be elected by the community as a whole to serve as a motherly advisor within council. She speaks with the voices of all the women from that community. So for these women, they are the heads of households, of the homes, of the families, and the communities. So the idea of bringing somebody back to become a citizen has to be at their discretion. So this captive will be brought before these women, and they will make the determination as to whatever they feel makes them a good fit for that community to then begin that process of adoption. So these people will be brought in, they'll be washed and bathed by these women, kind of like that notion they're accepting these folks as their children, right? They're cleansing them and cleaning them from wherever they come from, and then they will begin to educate them the same way they would have done for any of their natural born citizens, right? So this captive could be a child, or could be a middle-aged person or an older person, but this education is what's going to make them a proper citizen of that nation, right? How do you vote? How do you speak? What are the rules within the society? What are your obligations to this family? What are your roles to that clan? Everything they need to know to be a good, upstanding member of society. So this transition period of education is kind of like a personal purgatory. So in one sense, they're still an outsider, right? So by our standards, because they are not yet kin, they have not yet been adopted, their wants, their needs, their loves, their concerns, their worries are completely irrelevant to our society, right? At this point, it's on your former kinfolk to take vengeance on your behalf, to either come get you or to take other captives and start that system of war, right? But in this intern period, that woman who basically has taken them under her wing is their protector within that nation to ensure no harm is going to come to them, right? No disrespect, no ill treatment or anything like that. Because the objective is after this education is complete, they will eventually become a full-fledged citizen of that community, right? With the same equal rights and privileges as any other natural-born citizen. So they are the ones who are going to make sure that everybody is going to be accepting them into that society. So however long this takes, right? Sometimes I've seen reference where folks were adopted immediately, and sometimes it's been years if they were ever adopted, right? But eventually, once she bestows that title of son or of daughter on these captives, that's when their former connection to whatever is completely gone away. Now they are a full member of this society with the same equal rights and privileges to vote, to go to war, to marry, and etc. within this nation as an equal citizen. So for those men, just like any other man within that society is going to go off and marry a woman and become part of her family. But for these women who are brought in and adopted, they will eventually take over as head of household. They will eventually become their own matriarchs within their societies to continue the family that her adopted mother has put her in charge of, right? So in the 18th century, we see documentation of soldiers, of traders, of Indian agents, missionaries, who are going into these different communities, right? They're going to Cherokee villages and Shawnee villages and Iroquois villages, and who are making note that there are people here who don't look like everybody else, right? They look racially different from everybody else, but they dress like everybody else, they talk like everybody else, they vote like everybody else, they worship like everybody else. But most importantly, they're treated like an equal member of society, right? That's where this comes in from, this system of adoption. So in the 18th century, you're seeing many European folks, many African folks who are being captured, brought in and adopted into these native societies and living there as equals. Now, that fulfills that first role, the idea of bringing somebody back to replenish a household, right? This is how we're going to bolster our numbers with outsiders. The second instance, the idea of what we call blood law, which is basically the golden rule that keeps all of our separate societies from devolving into all-out chaos. Basically, whatever you do to us, we are going to do to you. If you come capture one of us, we're going to go capture one of yours. And if you kill one of ours, we're going to go kill one of yours, right? So when we think of war, for these societies, war really happens on more of a personal case-by-case basis rather than a political motivation of nation against nation, right? So these wars could be very small skirmish battles and are over as quickly as they begin, because as soon as those individuals receive satisfaction for that perceived slight or whatever, that's the end of that war, right? So we don't really have these long drawn out conflicts that involve thousands and thousands of people fighting out on the field until eventually there's nobody left. It's really just these couple of Cherokee guys got a bone to pick with these couple of Yuchi guys over here, so they're going to go hash it out, and then when they're done, right? So war for us can be very isolated between the fraternity of folks who like to do that thing. So you can kind of consider this like professional soldiers. So nobody is ever pressed into military service, right? War is not compulsory. Within these nations, not all men have to be warriors. It is a personal decision that a young man will take for himself to say, I like the way those guys talk about one another, right? Or I like that lifestyle, so I want to go out with those guys. So then those young men will implore those men to start taking them out into war and to start experiencing that life. And through that lifestyle, he's going to start to accrue some status and notoriety, not only amongst his peers, but to other warriors from different communities and societies. So the way that these men will identify one another is going to be with tattoos and markings on their face or on their body, certain hairstyles, accoutrements that they'll carry or wear upon their person. That presents to another person from another nation, I'm your huckleberry, right? So if you're looking for somebody to take some violence out on, you're looking for somebody to make a name off of, I'm the guy that you do that to, right? So don't touch this community or these women or those children. I'm the one that's willing to do it. So when those folks go to war, right, they agree to this thing. This is a measure of status, of challenge, of battle amongst those men that has nothing to do with their communities at home. So when they go to war and they eventually start to lose their lives, the problem is they are not the heads of household, right? So even though they consent to that thing, they are removing brothers, fathers, husbands, uncles from their wives, from their sisters, from their mothers back home. So somebody needs to pay that debt. So in this instance, somebody has taken something from us, so we are going to take it from them, right? So when these men go to war, sometimes not all those warriors are going to be killed out in the field. Sometimes these men are going to be bound up and taken captive and brought back to serve that debt. So this captive may be made to sing his death song. But unlike an adoptive person, this death song is a way for him to make peace with his creator and with his captors, right? So in our instance, his idea of his death song tells us who he is, where he's from, what battles he's been engaged in, who his mother is, who his father is, what his clan is, what community he comes from, and etc. And any other identifying factor that will inform us about what family he is coming from. So with him being brought here to serve this debt, we are no longer going to hold any animosity towards his family or his kin, which means nobody else from his family is going to be put in harm's way, right? Because we got you, we have him. So this man being brought back to this community is usually noticed as what's dying a good death, right? Because this guy, the way he's lived his life has been a personal choice. he has chosen to engage in these acts of violence against other nations. And so all the markings and tattoos that he has, how many more people has he taken from us, right? How many more folks is he responsible for removing from this world? So each of those markings on his body represents a kill, right? Or that personal status of military service. And so he will be tortured to draw all that violence out of him, right? So as a warrior, he is meeting his fate at the same end that he has caused upon other people. But eventually, once his life expires, that's where that debt comes in to be paid. So for the violence that he's caused against our community, by executing him, he has paid the debt for his kinfolk and his community back home. So we will no longer have to go and strike out against those folks. Our women in their grieving will harbor no pain or animosity towards his mothers and his sisters and his family. And so that's what I talk about. A lot of these wars can come to an end as quickly as they begin because of this system of blood law, right? You've got us, we got you. That's the end of it. So that right there, that second instance, right? You've taken from us and we've taken from you. That's what settles that debt within these wars, right? That notion of blood law. Now, the third one, the idea of hostage exchange. This one goes a little bit quicker because it's simply a way of dealing with foreign nations, right? So one example that I can give you, connecting it here to Williamsburg, is the idea of the 4 Shawnee hostages who were brought here to Williamsburg in 1774 after Lord Dunmore's war against the Shawnee and the folks up in the Ohio region, right? So the idea is Lord Dunmore was successful, right? His goal was to expand Virginia's borders. He was able to broker a treaty with the Shawnee folks to secure that, but the treaties were to be signed 6 months later. So they have this kind of loose interim bond of saying, we agree to do these things, but because winter's coming along, we have to get our armies back home so nobody's going to get caught out in the cold, right? So in this interim period, they agree to exchange hostages. So Lord Dunmore sends a couple of British officers up north to stay as guests of Chief Cornstalk in the Shawnee city of Scioto. And then here in Williamsburg, Lord Dunmore requests that those headmen send their sons here to Williamsburg to stay here as his guests. So in this war happens in the fall of 1774. These men arrive in December of 1774. It's West Compoy, Chinoosa, Newa, and Gatemwa. And they are talked about as being the princes of the Shawnee nation, right? So by Shawnee standards, they don't have a hierarchical system of government, right? They don't operate under a monarchy. So they don't have kings, queens, princes, or princesses. But by England's perception of their relationship to their father, they are regarded as the princes, right? These men are royalty. So these men are not going to be treated like any old prisoner of war, right? They're not going to be shackled. They're not going to be put in jail. They are here to serve as political guests of the governor. So they are the insurance policy that those relationships will hold out until treaties are signed in the spring, and then the treaties will become the physical assurance of those negotiations, and everybody gets to go back home. But during their stay, they are treated like any other French or Spanish ambassador would be, right? So they're taken to Norfolk to go see the ships and the ports. They're taken to go see which theater plays. They get to attend the ball that Lady Dunmore throws over at the palace as honored guests, in which they give a short speech and participate in the dances. They get to use the governor's personal carriage whenever they please. So, I mean, they're enjoying a lot of the things that the larger portion of Virginia society is not going to have access to, right? That royal treatment. And so for English and Native relations, that notion of building bridges between these different tribes has to do with the idea of looking at each other as equals, right? By eating with them, by sitting with them, learning with them. That's kind of the same concept that a lot of these southeastern and northeastern tribes work under as well. So in a lot of instances, there is a lot of open political discourse between, like I said, our allies as well as our enemies, in which we will send runners and messengers between these communities to open up those lines of communication. This is done because we feel that the best way to learn about people is to work with you, is to eat with you, is to laugh with you, is to dance with you. And so by sending one of our folks to go live in and amongst your communities, they're easing those tensions of what are the things that fell apart that we initially didn't know about that we can help rectify, right? And then two, what are the things that I can learn about you now that when the new treaties are signed, we can move forward together stronger as allies, right? Stronger as kin. And so these exchange of hostages are really serving as political liaisons between these different nations. So when you think about the idea of like, well, how do they communicate, right? How does the governor talk to these different tribes? It has to do with these modes of translators and hostages going back and forth between these different nations. So within our tribes, we also have folks who have to translate between different nations, right? So Cherokee folks speak a different language than Shawnee. So these political liaisons are the ones who are opening up that communication between our different nations as well, all right? So there's a whole realm of political discourse that goes on here in the Americas long before European arrival and then simply continues after European arrival, right? But this topic of hostage exchange and of captive taking and adoption and citizenship and family, this really ends up coming to an end in the early 1800s. Where there are a lot of impositions by the United States to set a standard of criteria for civilization that many tribes will have to meet to continue political relations as equals with the federal government. And so part of that is divesting family from government, right? So kind of what you can see is there is no legal system or framework of government. It's all purely based upon individual interactions and acceptance, right? So the idea of your mother being your connection to a tribe, government and family are basically intertwined, right? They're not separate. So with changes to, like, say, the Cherokee Constitution adopted in 1813, where they enter under a constitutional form of government, not everybody agrees with it, right? But the larger portion of the government is going to be accepted by the United States, is accepting those different changes. So the idea of adopted citizens, right, especially with a lot of our black citizens, are removed from our roles because they are trying to be seen as equals in the eyes of their white counterparts in the 19th century. And so you start to see a big shift in this idea of hostage exchange and adoption and captive taking begin to come to an end. So with that gives you like a rough roundabout as to why this kind of practice occurs in the 18th century, which may be relatively new for many European folks here in the Americas, and why they're being involved in this event. So I'd like to see, within the last few minutes that we have together, do you all have any questions or any kind of curiosities? Sure.
Do any of the fights ever last longer?
Sometimes, right? So the question is do any of these fights or do these wars last longer than that system of blood law? The answer is yes. So when we think about the idea of mourning wars, these are these wars that kick off these lengthy processes because of this notion of captive taken, right? And it only starts because somebody died and we have to bring back a captive. The problem is say this man's been tasked with replacing somebody. So he's going to go to this community and he's going to take a captive and bring them back. Now what do they have to do? Yeah, either fight them or get somebody else, right? Now they may not come back to our community. They may go to a different tribe and take somebody from there. And now that tribe has to go take somebody from there. And so it's basically this domino effect in which it happens to somebody, so they got to do it to somebody else, they got to do it to somebody else. And it may continue like that, but when does it end? It really harbors along the women. So in many instances, we've seen instances of where a woman, right, who has had her family taken to replace somebody else there, she might say, that person's too important to my family, I need to go get them back. And so she will go to that community and then petition that family to say, I understand that you're in a time of need and you're grieving, but the person you took from me is too much for me to lose, so I've brought these gifts to ransom for them back. And so if that woman agrees and says, okay, I accept that, thank you, she'll take those goods, and then that woman gets to return back with her family, and then that's the end of it, right? Or a woman says, the person who was taken from me, I don't have any fear of what's going to happen to them, right? So for women or children, more often than not, they are not going to be in danger of being harmed, because when they're taken to another community, they're going to become an equal member of that society, so nothing bad is going to come. So there might be women who say, the loss of this person, I'm not fearing for their lives, and I know this might not be the last time to see them, and so it's more beneficial to let them become part of that society and end any further conflict or tensions. So a lot of the ways that these conflicts come to an end in regards to adoption and debt paying wholly rest upon women. So there's, I'll give you two more examples and I'll take another question. There's a really neat example that I saw about a warrior. Basically, he was brought in to be tortured, right? So his job was to pay that blood debt as a warrior. But when he came in, one of those women was so impressed by his candor and his willingness to accept his fate that she spared his life. So initially where he's going to be killed, she goes, absolutely not. He's going to be more of a fit to replace the son that I just lost. So I'll accept him into my family. So then that also settles it, right? So instead of having to kill him, she adopts him, and then she's still satisfied in her loss. Yeah. What other kind of questions do you have about it? That was a very good question. Thank you. Yes?
Over time, the U.S. government has gotten involved with a Indian society on the reservation. How has that affected the basic structure of the
That's a very good question too, right? So as time goes on and things like the imposition of the United States really change the family structure, the government systems of these societies, it, up to the modern day, it drastically changes how they operate, right? So in many communities, there's a split. There's your legal government, right, with your elected officials, your chief, your vice chief, treasurer, tribal council, etc. And then there is your traditional systems of society, right? Folks who speak the language, practice the religion and family structures and dances and everything that kind of ties to the cultural. So that was the big thing, was initially the idea was separating culture from government, right? And then there are some communities who do have those things combined. But a lot of it comes from those changes of the United States trying to, what do you kind of say, culturally genocide a lot of these societies in removing what makes them Indian people to make them members of the more dominant society. But what really changes is the idea of what you would refer to as Indianness, right? So if you've ever heard the term, the idea of, well, I'm 1/4 such and such, right? Or my father was 100% such and such, and you can see it in their cheekbones and their hair and stuff like that. That's really more of a modern concept of the idea of blood quantum. So blood quantum was a way of measuring how long a tribe exists, right? So if a tribe is 100%, but they marry out, then that diminishes their bloodline, right? And as they marry out again, it's going to be diminished so far. So eventually, this tribe will no longer cease to exist, which means the obligations and the responsibilities of the federal government to that tribe no longer exist. So it's a way of measuring how long these tribes exist as political entities, right? Because initially, it's very hard to keep a grasp on tribal populations if they can just bring people in and say, that's my son, that's a citizen, that's a citizen, that's a citizen. So those moves to kind of, funnel down who is a citizen and measure that by blood is what those big changes really come into be. So that's why our families initially, or in the 1800s and 1900s, are measured by that system of blood. And then that's still in use today, right? But it's purely up to the tribe to determine their own means of enrollment and citizenship, right? So as opposed to it being just a woman saying, that's my son or that's my daughter, and they are now a citizen, now there's a legal structure of citizenship, right? So to give you like an idea for myself, I'm an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Isleta, which is my mother's community from out west. I am a legal citizen of that nation, right? Because of the determination that the tribe has made that accepts me as a citizen. But I am a descendant of my father's tribe, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians out in western North Carolina, but I'm not an enrolled citizen there, right? My father was enrolled, but I am not, so I'm considered a descendant of. And that's purely based upon those changes that happen over time. So in many instances, it would be very easy to find somebody whose mother is from one tribe, whose father is from another tribe, but don't meet the qualifications for enrollment in either. And so, by European standards, they are a native person, but have no legal connection to any tribal nation, right? And so that's where you will see big changes in where you're losing citizens in kind of that way as well. So to give you an idea, if you go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right, BIA.gov online, there are 576 federally recognized tribes that exist in the United States as federal entities under the United States government. By legal standards, that's what constitutes a native person in the United States, is somebody who is an enrolled citizen of a federally recognized tribe. But there are many folks who don't have that status, right? Not to say that they weren't ever part of a nation or were removed from a nation or lost their citizenship by some parts. but that's how things have changed from the colonial period up to the present day. And then, of course, it's much more complicated than that, but that's as much as I understand. Yeah. Y'all have any other questions before I cut you loose? Certainly.
Would the Brafton school that was here at Williamsburg be considered similar to like the residential schools of later time periods, or was it more of just a school?
That's a good question, right? So the idea of the Brafton Indian School over here at the College of William Mary is initially established as a charity school. So it's very different from the boarding schools of the 19th and 20th century, which was the forced education of Native people. Again, that notion of kill the Indian, save the man, right? And so we will remove whatever connects them to their culture by their language, songs, dances, and etc. by force, right? Either through military boarding schools or church-run boarding schools. Now, the Brafton Indian School, much like Harvard, were initially founded as charity schools. So England's intent was, if we give these folks the opportunity to get an English education in reading, writing, speaking English, of course, introduction to the Church of England, they will find enough value in this on their own that they will convert willingly, right? So if we just give them the opportunity to see the light, they'll accept it on their own, right? So for many local tribes, eventually their treaties are reestablished to where they have to have a certain number of boys at the school at all times. But when they go back to their land grants, to their communities in which their tribes reside, it was usually said that the school was highly unsuccessful because when they went back home, they just went back doing whatever their community members do anyway, right? And it was like they never attended the school in the first place. Many other communities, again, kind of tying it back to the idea of political exchange, right? There are other foreign nations like Cherokees and Creeks and specifically Cherokee with Charles Murphy, Henry Balby, who's a Wyandotte man, and then John Montour, who's a Delaware fella, who come to Williamsburg to attend that Brafton school to become political liaisons for their nation. So it's the idea is as opposed to having just our traders or our agents or whatever translating and negotiating these treaties for you, why don't you send your boys here to attend the school, we'll educate them, and we'll send them back to you, and they will become a political asset to your nation. And so in that instance, you could say that that education was successful because we know that, like Charles Murphy, he pops up in 2 treaty signings later after attending the school as a translator, right? So he specifically is utilizing the education that he got here in Williamsburg to assist his community in negotiating treaties and things like that. So in the 18th century, schools like the early Indian schools under the colonial government is really a form of underhandedly drawing Native folks into this kind of notion of civilization, right? So if we just give them the opportunity, they'll obviously see it on their own that they'll convert to these things willingly, rather than us having to force that on them. Yeah. So with that, folks, I'd like to thank y'all for joining me this evening, and I hope you really enjoyed the program. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you. Appreciate it. But I will let you know that if you're going to be with us for the next few days, and if I didn't get to your question or you think of a question later on, I of course invite you to come join us again tomorrow. So in the morning, we'll be out over at the Carriage House from 10 to 12, talking about the Shawnee hostages at the Palace. And we'll be out over at the encampment over here on the corner of Botetourt and Nicholson, again talking about the different tribes who are coming and going through Williamsburg to make treaties with the governor, and a little bit about what the local tribes' situation here in the 18th century. And then we'll be having another one of these American Indian Life series again at 4 o'clock, but with a different presenter and a different topic. So if you come back to this program tomorrow, you're going to see somebody else and you'll get a whole new content. All right? But other than that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I appreciate having you. Y'all have a good day. Yeah.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.